I picked Alden Correa to win as an underdog. I picked Jesus Aguilar to win as an underdog. Alexander Hernandez, Rafa Garcia, David Martinez, and you all thought I was crazy, telling me these were terrible picks, telling me I'm picking all underdogs, saying I have no idea what I'm talking about, saying you're gonna fade me this week, saying I'm gonna make you lose all your money. The underdogs did come through. Most of them did come through. But the most important fight of the night did not come through. The lock of the night, Gene Silva, he folded. I was on the hype train of another fighting nerd, and I paid the price for it. So let's move on from last week. We're stepping into a new week, UFC Perth. We got Dominick Reyes taking on Carlos Ulberg in UFC Perth. So welcome to this week's prediction video, where I'll be discussing, breaking down, and predicting each and every fight. Let's get started with the first fight of the night. We got Cam Rowston versus Andre Petroski. My pick for this fight is going to be Cam Rowston. I'm picking Cam Rowston. Cam Rowston winning his Contender Series fight like 2 weeks ago. It seems like in a style that was pretty impressive. Getting a first round knockout. Now making his UFC debut in his hometown in Perth. Training out of City Kickboxing as well, carrying that momentum into this fight. We know he's in shape, and we know the UFC wants to hype him up in his hometown. I mean, his striking looks sharp. I see him putting that up on display in this fight versus Andre Petroski. I mean, Cam is clearly the A side here. He's bigger, faster, longer in his hometown. He's carrying that momentum from his last fight. Coming up against a fighter like Andre Petroski, who hasn't shown to be too durable when the right shots land. I can see Cam throwing the right shots, landing clean, winning this fight either by decision or knockout. We've seen Cam Rowston get taken down before in his Contender Series fight versus Torres Finney, but the difference level in wrestling there, when it comes to Finney and Petroski, is pretty significant. I don't think Petroski is going to have an easy time controlling Rowston for a long period of time. And the thing about Petroski is that he gets hit a lot. He was dropped in his last fight versus Edmund Shabazian, but still managed to go the distance. But he has 4 losses and 3 of them come by knockout. He isn't as durable as he looks or as people make him out to be. And yeah, Cam has been knocked out once before as well. I did some research on the guy who knocked out Cam, and he seems like a pretty decent fighter. I don't think Petroski will have him in any sort of trouble, especially not in the striking realm. And when it comes to Cameron Rowson, he's coming out of City Kickboxing and a gym well known to be a high level gym. Especially with striking. The strikers that come out of that gym, like Israel Adesanya, Kai Kara France, Navajo Stirling, Carlos Orberg, Alexander Volkanovski. These guys are high level strikers who can handle someone with mid tier level grappling like Petroski. And even then, Cam Rowson has more submission wins on his record than knockouts. 6 submission wins, 5 knockouts. People know him as a striker because of his last fight on the Contender Series where he got that first round knockout. But this guy is well rounded. He can take care of himself on the ground or on the feet. His striking and distance management should be enough to get him a win versus Petroski here, who's primarily a striker. I think when it comes to striking, Cam Rowson has him beat for sure, and because of his background in wrestling, it should be enough to deal with any wrestling Petroski tries to present in this fight. Petroski's going to try to make it ugly in this matchup to find any sort of success, but Rowson has shown good distance management, engaging when he feels like he's ready. And I see Cam Rowson throwing leg kicks, body kicks, capitalizing on Petroski's defensive holes and staying on the outside, throwing more volume, landing the more accurate shots, keeping it on the feet. So, and yeah, I got to pick Cameron Rowson. He's long, fast City Kickboxing striker with grappling in his arsenal as well. He's got the momentum, the hometown edge, where Petroski, I feel like he's wrestling first. He is hittable, and 3 out of his 4 losses have come by knockout. He can slip as the fight starts to go on. So I see Cam Rowston keeping it on the feet and then stuffing any entries from Andre Petroski, and he'll likely get a TKO in this matchup, right? So moving on to our next fight, we got Brando Pericic versus Elisha Ellison. My pick for this fight is Brando Pericic. I'm picking Brando Pericic. This guy Brando, man, he looks pretty good. You know, he's also fighting out of city kickboxing as well, I believe. You know, he throws some nasty hooks, big overhands to close the distance, gets you in the clinch, throws nasty elbows, even goes for takedowns. You know, he has really nice leg trips to get you down, and he lands some nice ground and pound when he's got you down there, right? And he can transition from different positions pretty nicely. You know, it's such a fast and chaotic pace he brings to the first round, and on top of that, he's absolutely huge, standing at 6'5". And for a guy that big, he seems pretty versatile in his strikes. You know, he likes to throw kicks as well, head kicks, leg kicks, which shows he's more athletic than he looks. You know, I mean, he puts up a frantic pace in the first round, and it's hard to keep up with him. You know, all his victories come by first round, come in the first round, and he's throwing everything at you, which just seems so overwhelming for his opponents. You know, I feel like that style could work against someone like Elisha, you know, who seems patient and calculated in the striking. And I just feel like he's going to get overwhelmed and ran over by the bigger guy here, you know, in the clinch and also in the more powerful shots that are being landed. You know, Elisha started fighting a little over 2 years ago, and that isn't really a good sign. You know, plus his background is in jiu-jitsu, and he's going to have a hard time trying to take down this beast of a man in Brando. Plus, we've seen Elisha get controlled in the clinch before. Also not a great sign for him coming up against someone like Brando. You know, obviously these guys don't have much experience. You know, it's someone with 5 fights fighting someone with 6 fights. So talk about lack of experience. But they both have one loss. You know, the guys they are beating and having success over, they have terrible records, so it's hard to gauge how good they actually are. You can say Brando has beaten the better opposition because one of his victories, his opponent actually had a decent record. I just think the hometown guy here, Brando, will get the job done. You know, fighting out of city kickboxing, a great gym, being insanely bigger than his opponent, seems more well-rounded with the better skill set. I see him overwhelming the American Elijah here. And in this matchup, you know, I see him throwing more uh, and landing more strikes. He's going to fight at his own pace, you know, being physically stronger than his opponent to the point where he can dictate where the fight takes place. And on top of that, there will be a superior striking advantage for Brando here. And being so much bigger than Elijah won't have an easy time trying to take down Brando. So he'll just be eating shots as long as the fight lasts, in my opinion. So Brando, you know, he's huge for the division. He puts up a frantic pace in round one. His clinch trips, his elbows, his variety of kicks. I think it's going to be too much for Elijah, who's patient, but he's kind of new to the scene, more newer than Brando, and limited experience. Doesn't come out of the well-known gym like Brando does, you know. And he's going to try to get this fight on the ground, but I just think he has much weaker clinch and takedowns part of his game. You know, it's not gonna be as strong as Brando's. So I'm picking Brando. I think he's gonna overwhelm him early, and he's gonna use his size and power in the clinch, especially to dominate. That's if it gets into the clinch. Probably a first round knockout for Brando. Moving on to our next fight, we got Michelle Montague versus Luana Carolina. So I'm picking Michelle Montague to win this fight. You know, Michelle, the hometown gal, undefeated, 6-0, all 6 victories coming by submission. You know, she gets the same submission win every fight. You know, the rear naked choke. All 6 of her victories is a rear naked choke. She's 6-0. She's had 4 fights in the PFL and a fight in Bellator, meaning she's not fighting in some random unknown organizations, which is great to see, right? But when I first saw her record and I saw that she only gets the rear naked choke in all her fights, which while she's pretty much fighting cans, you know, I instantly thought, okay, she's a rear naked choke or bust type of fighter. But then I watched tape on her. Dude, she's built like a tank. You know, she's standing at 5'10". She's so dominant and strong. Her double legs are so aggressive, and her ground and pound is ferocious. You know, look, the thing is, to be undefeated is one thing, but to get a win in the UFC is a completely different story, especially getting a win over a UFC veteran like Luana Carolina, and now fighting Luana, who's already had 9 fights in the UFC, pretty much a UFC veteran at this point. This is truly a big test for her as a debut, because Luana isn't bad at all, right? She dances around the octagon. She's hard to get a hold of. She hits you and moves out of the way, so you don't have time to counter her. She has nice leg kicks to keep you at distance, and she also has a win over Lupita Godinez, which is a great win to have as a female UFC fighter, but she's going to be significantly smaller than Michelle, and can see Michelle dominating her in the clinch and grappling exchanges. Especially with how Luana is primarily a striker, I can see Michelle dominating the wrestling exchanges. And the thing is, all we've seen from Michelle is her getting the rear naked choke 6 times in a row now. And now she's fighting someone with a ton of UFC experience and who knows her way around the octagon, right? And who knows how to move around, stick and move. And I was going to say, there's not enough information on Michelle to tell me she has what it takes to remain undefeated in her debut against a UFC veteran. But Michelle actually, she had a 3-round fight in her second pro fight where she wasn't able to get the rear naked choke in the first round, despite dominating her opponent on the ground the whole first round. In rounds 2 and 3, she fought smart. She didn't gas out. She kept her guard up. She never tried to brawl, maintained her distance, landed the better shots, and she wasn't just spamming takedowns. Like, she wasn't panic wrestling at all. And she was striking for a bit, and then she surprised her opponent with the takedown in the third round, From the looks of it, Michelle looks so strong in the cage, I mean, she's just bulldozing her way into getting takedowns. She's defensively sound. She throws strikes to close the distance, and once she gets a hold of you on the ground, it's pretty much game over, I think the size and stylistic matchup completely favors Michelle here, being that much bigger than her opponent in this matchup, and she's going to look for takedowns against someone who's primarily a striker. I do think she'll find success. One thing to note as well, obviously Michelle, undefeated as a pro, perfect record, but as an amateur, she was 9-2, and those 2 losses came from the same person, a Brazilian fighter named Sabrina de Souza, who's actually seems to be pretty good. Sabrina was undefeated as an amateur and still undefeated as a pro, so there's no shame in those 2 losses. She took the same amateur fighter to the Brazilian, in the amateur career, right? But because that just shows the level that she's at, but she hasn't beaten anyone high level. Michelle hasn't. She hasn't really beaten anyone high level, whereas Luana kind of has. But I like the stylistic matchup here. I like her size advantage, and I think she's going to be the bigger grappler fighting a smaller striker, which should favor her. She's 6-0 right now. Big chain wrestler with vicious top game, strong rear naked chokes, strong cardio from what we've seen so far. And Carolina, she's going to be a mobile striker. She's a UFC vet, but I feel like she can get out physical and out grappled in this matchup. So the pick is Michelle Montague. I just think she's going to get her in the clinch, get her on the ground, get some takedowns, take her back, and probably get a submission win or just a grinding victory to a decision here. Right, so moving on to our next fight, we got Jamie Mullarkey versus Rolando Bedoya. This was actually a pretty tough pick, but I'm going to go Jamie Mullarkey to win this fight, Jamie Mullarkey, he's a striker first, but he's as average as it gets. The thing is, he's usually losing to pretty decent strikers, pretty decent fighters, right? Losing to Mauricio Rufy in a striking match, losing to Muhammad Naimov. These guys are pretty decent, He's facing Rolando Bedoya, who hasn't had a single win in the UFC, losing all 3 fights by unanimous decision. This guy, I feel he's just way below average, and this is going to be another loss, in my opinion. This guy, he'll probably be going 0-4 in the UFC after this fight. I feel like the UFC wants Jamie Mullarkey to get a win in his hometown, and they gave him what seems to be like the easiest fight in the division, but Bedoya isn't terrible. Bedoya, he has slow reaction times. He has bad timing on his shots. He gets hit often. He struggles to get takedowns. He's a lot more stationary than Jamie. I can see Jamie moving around the octagon and engaging in striking exchanges on his terms, right? But yeah, and I can see Bedoya kind of chasing and swinging at air. And Bedoya does like to throw a lot of kicks, but there's not much power behind his shots. There's no thud. Whereas with Jamie Mullarkey, I feel he will have the more impact behind his shots. Mullarkey seems to be more measured and calculated in his striking. He seems to be more disciplined to the game, and fighting in his hometown, he's going to be the hometown guy. I feel like he's locking in for this fight, and he's taking this fight seriously. Coming off of two back-to-back knockout losses, this is a major step down in competition for Jamie Mullarkey. I think Mullarkey will be the faster guy, more versatile in his strikes, better footwork, landing the better and more accurate shots. And I see him keeping the jab in his face, moving in and out, using his movement. And I can see Bedoya being a step behind the whole fight. Eating shots, not being able to maintain the pace of the fight, losing the striking exchanges. And Mullarkey has been knocked out in 6 out of his 8 losses, but Bedoya doesn't really have that thud in his shots. Plus, if he needs to, Mullarkey can drag this fight to the ground because he has the wrestling advantage in this one, in my opinion. So, Jamie Mullarkey, he is mainly a striker. More than half of his wins come by knockout, TKO, but in the UFC, he only has 2 wins by knockout. He's lost 4 times by knockout in the UFC. His last 3 losses have all been by knockout, and he's coming off of 2 back-to-back knockout losses. So it's not like he's the next champion or anything. I just think he just has enough to get past this below average fighter who doesn't have a lot of pop in his shots. I just see Mullarkey having the cleaner boxing, better footwork, can mix in the wrestling if he wants to. And this is a big step down in competition for him. Whereas Bedoya, he's 0-3 in the UFC. He has low power, slow reads, slow reaction times. He struggles to finish takedowns. So I just think Jamie Mullarkey is going to outpoint him with volume and probably grind on him using his wrestling against the fence if he needs to, right? So moving on to our next fight, we got Colby Thicknesse versus Josias Musasa. I'm taking Colby Thicknesse to win this fight. So we got Musasa, who's been fraud checked really badly in his UFC debut as a huge favorite, like a -1,000 favorite. He ate a head kick, got dropped, got submitted. His nickname is the Knockout Wizard. Brother, he was knocking out regular pedestrians. There was no reason for him to have been that big of a favorite, right? Now facing Colby Thicknesse, the hometown guy here. He's a pupil of Alexander Volkanovski, who Colby Thicknesse just lost a decision. He lost a decision to Ilia Topuria's brother, which is impressive in itself to not get finished by Topuria. Alexander Topuria, that guy, he's built like a tank. He's hard to take down, super composed, just like his brother. He throws stinging shots, impressive counters, and just has elite grappling. And Colby Thicknesse looked locked in the whole fight. He was game the whole fight. He showed great footwork. He was trying to hit and not get hit, move around. But the style that Topuria brings is so hard to deal with that. That pressure boxing. It's like they feint their shots, but they don't really, they make it seem, it's like their feints work really well. They just come forward without really throwing anything, and it just confuses the opponent because it's like they're expecting to get hit. They block the shot they expect to come. Nothing comes their way, and it isn't until they let their guard down where they instantly get hit. That style is just so frustrating to deal with. And then before you know it, you're getting suplexed and thrown across the octagon. Like that Topuria style, it's so hard to deal with. And Thicknesse, he was able to last the whole fight without getting finished. And like I said, Thicknesse was there trying to win the fight the whole time, moving around, active with his leg kicks, body kicks. Just a hard time gauging the distance on Topuria. And I'd say the majority of the later rounds, like 2 and 3, especially 3, Topuria was just ragdolling him with the wrestling, and we know Musasa isn't going to be doing that. He's mainly a striker, right? And against Musasa was taken down 4 times in the first round, only in the first round in his Contender Series fight. That was just the first round alone, getting taken down that many times. His striking, it was decent, but I think Thicknesse is going to have an easy time taking him down if the striking gets uncomfortable. I think the striking exchanges could be competitive, but when it comes to grappling, I think Thicknesse would be able to control him enough to persuade the judges in his favor. Plus, Thicknesse has decent head movement. He's durable, he's well-rounded, and the only vulnerabilities we've seen from him is really getting out-wrestled by a world-class wrestler, like Topuria, and somewhat in the striking as well, but Musasa isn't going to bring that world-class wrestling here. He isn't going to bring any wrestling at all, in fact, right? And also not bringing in an impressive resume. other than the guy he fought in the Contender Series in a fight he won by split decision. Nothing impressive in his victories. I think Thicknesse can utilize the grappling here and find success, control the pace of the fight, and weather any storm that Musasa has to offer and win the exchanges as the fight goes on. So Colby Thicknesse, he's also the pupil of Volkanovski, like I said. He's durable. He has good kicks. He's willing to wrestle and control. Where Josias, he has that hype. He had that hype behind him. But if you look at the rest of his wins before the Contender Series fight, they were really to nobodies, right? And he got exposed really badly in his debut. He has shaky takedown defense. So I just think Colby Thicknesse is going to be the uh safer fighter. He's going to be defensively sound. He's going to have top control, and he'll probably win this fight by decision. So moving on to our next fight, we got Jonathan Micallef versus Oban Elliott. This was also another tough fight to pick, but I'm going to pick Jonathan Micallef to win this fight. So I'm going Micallef because his debut, I thought it was really impressive. He pretty much dominated Kevin Jusey. He dropped him with a nasty head kick early in the first round. He seemed so fluid in his movement, whereas Oban Elliott, he can be a bit stiff in the way he moves. He strikes like it's someone pressing buttons in a video game making him strike. I don't know how to explain it, but Micallef will flow with his shots. He'll throw a body kick and instantly follow up with a right hand down the middle. Excuse me. It's hard to predict what strike he'll be throwing next, right? And Oban Elliott kind of plays that tit for tat game with you, And to talk about that body kick for Micallef, the level of activity he has with that body kick in his last fight is insane, because every kick he threw to the body was stinging Kevin Jusey and wearing him down, and he threw a ton of those in that fight. I mean, if you looked at Kevin Jusey's ribs, only after the end of the first round, you'd see it's all type of colors. It was red, purple, black. It looked like he was internally bleeding. That's how badly his body kicks sting. Micallef's body kicks sting, and it was just multiple kicks at a time and time again. And he uses that to gauge distance. If you want to run from him, he'll throw that, and in the pocket, he's running. He's ready to throw down too. Kevin was throwing right hands back at him, but Micallef just took it, stayed locked in. There was a difference in terms of their shots with Micallef and Elliott. Micallef kick slaps you like a whip, and Elliott, he can be a bit hesitant at times. And like in his Basil Hafez fight, the volume was low for Elliott before he landed that shot that landed clean. Micallef does get hit, and if Oban Elliott lands that same right hand on Micallef like he did to Basil Hafez, it could be a quick night. But I think Micallef shows out in this fight, in his hometown. I know Elliott is coming into this fight after a loss to Seung Hyung Ko. He's like motivated to get another win. I just see Micallef throwing more volume, more stinging shots, and we saw Elliott get ragdolled pretty badly in his last fight. I mean, he got whooped in every area of the fight, and he was the biggest favorite on the card, I believe, on that night. Plus, the way that Micallef got into the UFC was through a triangle choke on the Contender Series. So if this fight hits the mat, I got Micallef winning in that area as well. So this is going to be a really good fight. I had trouble picking who would win, but I'm going with my gut. And I see this fight being mostly a striking battle. I just believe in the hometown guy to live up to the moment and get the fight done. Because Micallef is really fluid in his kickboxing, He has brutal body kicks. His submission game is always live. And I just think Elliott is a bit too stiff compared to Micallef. He plays that tit for tat style. He has a dangerous right hand, but he's hittable and he can get out grappled really badly, as he's shown in his last fight. So I just think Micallef will have higher volume, more layers to the game, and he has that nasty body kick. So I just think he's gonna win more minutes of this fight. So moving on, we got Lookboonmee versus Alexia Thainara. I'm gonna pick Alexia Thainara to win this fight here. She only has one fight in the UFC where she dominated Molly McCann, submitting her in the first round. But her as a person, who she is as a person, she fights and carries herself like she has a chip on her shoulder. I watched her on the Contender Series last year, and she had the same confidence and same dominant performance in that fight. Loma Lookboonmee, she's coming off of a win against Estela Nunes, who now Estela Nunes is on a 5-fight losing streak in the UFC. And it wasn't a convincing performance. There were times where Nunes was able to get a hold of her and control her. Someone like Thainara can exploit that because we've seen Loma get dominated in the wrestling. If this fight with Thainara remains on the feet, I can see Loma having success here because despite her being so small, standing at 5'1", it's hard to close the distance on her. It's hard to hit her because she manages distance so well, right? And she's compact, small, hard to hit. So when you do close the distance, you're gonna get punished for it. She punishes you really well. But when an opponent does get a hold of her or shoot for takedown, someone physically stronger than her that can control her over, that can have control over her and dominate the fight, um, that kind of shows where her weaknesses are. Like we saw in the Loma and Lupita Godinez fight where Godinez was able to secure multiple takedowns and control Loma throughout the fight. And Alexia Thainara is one of the few women in this division that has the strength to out physical her and implement that same game plan. Loma is mostly a striker and she's a really good one, but considering Thainara is strong enough to match her strength and is bigger than her and can out physical her, I can see her controlling Loma on the mat. Thainara comes forward, she's looking to put some damage on her opponents. Out of Thainara's 12 wins, eight come by submission, meaning she's a finisher, where Loma, 8 out of her 10 wins are by decision. I think Thainara is a force to be reckoned with. She's going to come forward, put the pressure on, and I think she's going to have her energy felt in there. She'll implement her will in that octagon. Her takedowns are dominant, and I'm a true believer of her ground game. And I think Thainara might have some trouble closing the distance early in the fight, but I do think eventually she will get a hold of her, wear her down, and drag her down and get another submission victory. And I think her striking is just good enough to allow her to set up those takedowns and be able to close the distance on her in order to get a hold of her, right? So, Loma, she does has that slick Muay Thai style, great distance management, but she can be smothered against strong wrestlers. So Thainara, she is very physically strong. She's a pressure grappler with 8 subs on her record. She comes to fight. She has good top control in this weight class. So I just think the clinch and takedowns, it's gonna work for her continuously throughout the fight. As soon as she gets a hold of her, it's pretty much in her territory, and she's a big submission threat when it comes to the ground. So the pick has to be Alexia Thainara. Moving on to our next fight, Navajo Stirling versus Rodolfo Bellato. I'm picking Navajo Stirling to win this fight. I gotta go with Stirling. He's one of my favorite prospects in the UFC right now. He's smart. He's a composed fighter. He's willing to win no matter where the fight goes. He just fought a tough dude last fight and showed how well-rounded he is as a fighter. He was able to wrestle him, control him in the later rounds after losing the first round. He outdogged him in the third round. He didn't gas out, didn't quit on himself after losing the first round. And I feel like we learned a lot about who he is as a fighter in that fight. He showed determination to win by any means possible. Obviously, still undefeated, 2-0 in the UFC right now. He'll be 3-0 after this win to Bellato. Whereas Bellato, his 2 losses on his record, they've come by Vitor Petroni. Both losses have come by Vitor Petroni, who knocked out Bellato both times. That really, that's really the only decent fighter he's ever fought. He's coming off of a weird no contest fight where he got knocked out by an illegal kick, but some people believe he faked the whole situation. Personally, I don't think he faked it. I think he was just actually dazed and confused and didn't know how to act. But if he did fake it, if that was actually him faking the whole situation, then that just says a lot about who he is as a fighter. Not willing to fight, not wanting to fight. But before that fight, he went to a draw with Jimmy Crute, which at times during the fight, especially during the end of the fight, resulted in a brawl type of fight. In the first round, Jimmy Crute had success. He even dropped Bellato in the first round. Then Bellato worked his way back into the fight in the second round. And then in the third round, it was both of them going at it. The difference with Stirling is that he won't engage in a brawl like Crute and Bellato did in the third round. That's not the type of fighter Navajo Stirling is. Navajo, he's gonna keep his distance. He's gonna snipe you from range. He's gonna pick you apart, plays it smart, and he's not the type to get lured into a brawl or rush a knockout, especially if he finds success early, like Jimmy Crute did to Bellato. So I just think Navajo would capitalize on a weaker opponent if he has him hurt in the first round and just build and keep up the jabs and keeps the leg kicks going, keeps the body kicks going. He built on the momentum and stick to what's working. In his last fight with Ivan Erslan, when Navajo got outstruck to the head in the first round, he was smart enough to adjust mid-fight and he was able to implement the wrestling, picked up the pace, and in the third round capitalized on the momentum he built, then drops Erslan to ultimately win the fight. And Bellato, I would say he's pretty much average everywhere. Doesn't really shine in one area of any martial art. Hasn't looked too impressive in any performance. And with Stirling, who's coming out of city kickboxing, he kind of has that it factor. I feel he has some aura to him. He showed how tough and determined he is as a fighter last fight. Showed how well-rounded his skill set is. I think we see him get a knockout in this matchup. He can apply pressure when he senses Bellato starting to break. When he senses Bellato starting to break down, I don't think he needs to implement the wrestling in this fight. I think he can win the striking exchanges and stuff any takedowns, but if he needs to, I believe in his wrestling as much as I do in his striking for Navajo, right? So I just see Navajo maintaining the distance, sniping from range, applying pressure, and fighting at his own pace. I think that we'll see Bellato go for takedowns and not find any success or find little success. Maybe he'll get when he'll go for a takedown, I can see Navajo reversing position or stuffing his takedowns, right? And I also can see Navajo winning the exchanges in the pocket when it gets there, when they're both standing in the pocket. I can see him winning those exchanges as well. So I just think Stirling is composed enough. He's well-rounded. He's a city kickboxing prospect who those guys, they tend to do pretty well on their come up to the UFC. When they get into the UFC, they usually win the first couple of fights, right? It isn't until when they face high-level opposition where they get really tested. And I don't feel Bellato is high-level opposition. And Navajo has smart pressure. He can adjust mid-fight if he needs to. Whereas Bellato, he is just kind of average everywhere. He is going to shoot for takedowns, but I see him getting those takedowns stuffed, and he's too willing to engage in brawls, where Navajo, he's too clean on the outside, and he's not going to engage in any brawls. He's going to keep it on the outside and snipe him from a distance. So I just think Navajo Stirling, he's going to control the fight with his range. He's going to mix levels if he needs to, and probably TKO Bellato in the third round or even win a clean decision. So moving on to our next fight, we got Justin Tafa versus Louis Sutherland. I'm going to go Louis Sutherland to win this fight. The Tafa brothers are back in action. Long-awaited return. Two of the greatest sibling prospects in the game right now. It's tied between them and the Taporio brothers, in my opinion. No, I'm just kidding. It's hard to back a Tafa brother these days with how they've been performing. Justin Tafa, coming off of 2 losses in a row now. 10 fights in the UFC, 0 notable wins. I mean, even zero notable losses. He hasn't really lost to anyone good. He's losing to taxi drivers like Taliesin Teixeira, but the UFC did cook him up a winnable fight here, in his hometown, giving him someone making their debut, but I don't even think he's going to win this fight. Every fighter that Justin Tafa has beaten, literally every fighter that he's ever beaten, they're all known for having a terrible chin. If you look at who Justin has beat, every single one of them has lost by knockout in about 90% of their losses. This guy Louis, he has never been knocked out. He seems durable. He seems to carry strong power. He'll be much bigger in there. From what I've seen in Louis Sutherland, he doesn't seem bad at all. He takes control of the center of the octagon. He seems measured in his striking. He's never been finished by strikes or submission. Has only ever lost by decision. And yeah, he's never fought UFC level competition. But Justin Tafa has only ever fought the lowest tier of competition in the UFC and hasn't even been winning. You know, Louis is going to be much bigger than him in there. And if you look at this guy's back, Louis' back muscles, I mean, his nickname is the Vanilla Gorilla, and the dude has a silverback gorilla type of back. His back is humongous, and when he's throwing left and right hooks at you, it's a scary sight. He holds a ton of power in his hooks. I think against someone as soft bellied as Justin Tafa is, if he goes shot for shot with this guy, I think Louis is going to have the much more devastating shots being landed. Justin is a kill or be killed type of fighter. All 7 of his wins come by knockout. So if he isn't knocking you out, you have the chance to win the fight. Louis has never been knocked out, and I can see Louis being measured in the first round, being patient enough to wait until the right shots presents itself, and then apply pressure when he smells blood. In his last fight, Tafa took one good knee to the stomach and folded instantly. I don't understand these heavyweights. 95% of them, they look like they don't train at all. They're so fat and soft in the belly, especially Justin Tafa. It's just such a disappointing performance last time, where he just instantly gave up after one good shot to the belly. And I can see Louis landing the shots that have more impact in this fight. He'll be moving better in and out. He moves well for someone his size. He's light on the feet, and he's proven to have a decent gas tank, winning 2 fights by decision. And that's not something we can say about Justin. Excuse me. Also, I've seen Louis in top mount. That was like a hiccup, but I've seen Louis in top mount landing ground and pound. Someone like Tafa, who has 0 ground game, I see him being dominated pretty much anywhere the fight goes. Unless he lands a random knockout shot, maybe he'll have success. But in the big 2025, I just can't back Justin to win a fight anymore. I just think Sutherland, he's going to be bigger in there. He's more durable. He has measured striking, great power, and he can grapple on top when the fight gets there. If he's on top mount, he can control Tafa there for sure. And Tafa is more of a kill or be killed type of fighter. His recent form has been poor. He's vulnerable to the body, and I feel he's more chin reliant as a fighter these days, where Louis Sutherland, he's going to have cleaner movement, moving in and out, cleaner entries. He can take this fight to the ground. I believe he'll be winning the clinch exchanges. He's going to land the heavier shots, most likely a knockout, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's a 29-28 decision for Louis Sutherland. Moving on. Tom Nolan versus Charlie Campbell. I'm going to pick Tom Nolan. Tom Nolan, the hometown guy here. He'll be 3 inches taller. He'll be younger by 5 years as well. The one loss on his record, I feel like that was so good for him to grow as a fighter. He's shown such great improvements since the fight he had versus Nicholas Mota, where he got knocked out in the first round. In that fight, he came forward trying to close the distance, leaving his chin exposed, just trying to box with Moto, then completely paid the price for it. In his most recent fight with Vyacheslav Borsov, he looked like a completely different fighter to compared to who we saw in the Moto fight. Nolan was throwing kicks to close the distance, flowing nicely in his strikes, not forcing anything, using his footwork, being defensively sound, fighting behind his jab, going for takedowns as well. Uh, jumped on the back of Borisov, looking for submissions, heavy top control, accurate with his shots, diverse strikes like head kicks, spinning kicks, nice counter shots as well. He showed a complete and well-rounded game in his skill set. Comparing this performance to the other one he had versus Moda, where it looked like he was just chasing Moda at times, staying in the pocket for longer than he should have, and trying to force a knockout, Nolan has improved a lot since then. And Charlie Campbell, he's shown improvements as well since his knockout loss to Chris Duncan on the Contender Series, where Duncan, he had Duncan wobbled a little bit. He walked forward with no sense of defense. He got absolutely brutalized with a monstrous right hand. Probably one of my favorite knockouts of all time. But yeah, Campbell has shown a bit of improvement since that fight. Still, I think in his last fight he had with Trevor Peek, he looked a bit rigid in the striking. He looked a bit stiff. Trevor was causing him a bit of trouble on the feet, and there were times where Trevor Peek was walking him down and even controlling him against the fence, and was able to take Charlie Campbell down, right? And someone like Tom Nolan, getting you in that position, it's going to be a lot harder to get out of that situation on the ground and on the feet as well, because Tom has been looking really fluid in his strikes. I see Tom Nolan being more creative in there, using feints and movements well, working his improved grappling skills. Probably is going to want to come in, pressure Nolan, move forward with combinations, but I think Nolan's footwork will work well in this fight against a fighter like Charlie. I think Nolan's length will be something he uses well in this fight, capitalizing on Charlie's aggressive style, which can leave him open to counters. I just see Nolan being more diverse in there, mixing in the kicks, working in the grappling. I think if someone like Trevor Peek can take you down, I think Tom Nolan can as well, and be heavier on the pressure on the ground, making sure that you stay down there. And Charlie's going to have to get respect early in this fight with a big shot, but to close the distance and maintain the striking defense for the whole fight with someone as long and elusive as Nolan, it's not going to be easy, right? So I just think Nolan's lengthiness is going to help him out a lot, and he's evolved a lot since his Moda loss. He's got great kicks now, knows how to be defensively sound, not rush in. He has great counters, improved wrestling and control, where Campbell's more of an aggressive boxer type of style. He's still hittable. His takedown defense is a bit suspect when he's under pressure. So I just think Tom Nolan's going to have more of a variety to his game plan, and his takedown threats are going to be there. So this will most likely end Tom Nolan decision, or Tom Nolan by club and sub. I can see that happening here as well. So moving on to our next fight. We got Jake Matthews versus Neil Magny. I'm going Jake Matthews to win this fight. I'm going to go Jake Matthews. So Jake Matthews has won 8 out of his last 11 fights. Those 3 losses have been to Michael Morales by decision, Sean Brady via 3rd round submission, and Matthew Selmsberger by decision, which is Matthew Selmsberger. It's the only loss that hasn't aged well. In fact, it aged horribly. Selmsberger is on like a 5-fight losing streak right now. But that was 3 years ago, and those losses to Sean Brady and Michael Morales are forgivable, because those guys are considered the elite of the division, right? And now coming off of a great performance against Shiri Njukwani, he's 31 years old now. He's in his prime right now, 3 wins in a row. He's fighting in his hometown against a 38-year-old Neil Magny, who's been fighting in the UFC since 2013. I can't see Magny winning this. He's coming off of a good performance against Alexia Dos Santos, he's also 38 years old, but against a much younger, hungrier guy like Jake Matthews, fighting in his hometown, I can't see Magny pulling this off. When it comes to Neil Magny fighting these younger guys, he just can't seem to hang with them. Jake has good grappling, he has good striking, he has good cardio. It's hard to see him losing this fight. I think there'll be a major athleticism difference in this matchup. Magny's striking defense isn't all that great. And I think uh can use the striking to utilize control with his grappling. Magny is long and hard to reach, but Jake is composed and knows how to manage distance and puts up a pace that Magny won't be able to keep up with. I don't think Magny's reach alone is enough to win him this fight. I think in a grinding, high-paced fight, we would see Matthews come out on top. Stuff any takedowns from Magny and win the striking exchanges throughout the fight. So, Matthews in his prime right now, 3 straight wins, sharp boxing. He has good reactions with his striking and grappling, and I just think he's the better athlete. Where Magny, he's vet savvy and he has the length, but he's slower. His defense is fading, and can't really hang with these younger guys, right? So the pick has to be Jake Matthews. He beats him in pretty much every area of the game. He mixes in takedowns. Most likely wins a decision here. Moving on to our next fight, we got Jimmy Crute versus Ivan Erslan. I'm gonna pick Jimmy Crute to win this fight. This is a great fight. We got Jimmy Crute coming into this matchup with one single win in his last 6 fights. And we have Ivan Erslan, who's 0-2 in the UFC right now. But I thought he didn't look too bad in his last fight with Stirling. He was composed, had decent footwork, went for takedowns, unsuccessful takedowns, however, had an accurate right hand that was landing throughout the fight, especially in the first round. I think the reason why Erslan couldn't find too much success versus Stirling was because of how active Stirling was with his kicks. Anytime Erslan tried to get close, Navajo would throw a leg kick, then body kick, then move away, and that was continuous throughout the fight. But I mean, Erslan had landed some decent right hands throughout the fight, but going up against a sniper like Stirling, it was only a matter of time until Stirling found the right shots to win the exchanges. I was initially going to pick Erslan here, but with Jimmy Crute finally coming back to the win column after his last fight, where he pretty much dominated Marcin Prachnio in the first round, he looked pretty good there. He used his in and out style with his striking, had a long jab, was able to continually take down Marcin at will throughout the first round. And I just thought he looked good, but it's easy to look good against a fighter like Marcin Prachnio. But I think Jimmy stuck to a great game plan, was able to execute it, and if he comes into this fight with the same game plan as he had with Marcin, I do think he can be successful here because we've seen Erslan be able to get controlled in the clinch and get taken down. He begins to fade as the fight starts to go long. I think that in and out style works well against a fighter like Erslan, who doesn't really move his head too much. And as the fight starts to go into the later rounds, I think Jimmy Crute will grow as Erslan will start to fade. Plus, the ability to mix in takedowns should be enough to get Jimmy Crute a win here. The only real threat Erslan presents in his fights is his boxing, really. He rarely throws kicks. His takedowns are defendable, and it's almost too basic, while Jimmy Crute presents a more well-rounded skill set, which makes me favor him more in this matchup. So I just think Jimmy Crute's going to be able to use his jab, change levels if he has to, and he can bank on takedowns and have control on top. While Ivan Erslan, his right hand is real, it has real power. I think it begins to fade as the fight goes on. He has limited kicking in his game. Excuse me. And his clinch work and takedown defense, it's exploitable, So I just think Jimmy Crute's gonna come in with that in and out boxing style and be able to repeat takedowns if he has to. Most likely win a decision here. Moving on to our next fight. Jack Jenkins versus Ramon Tavares. The pick has to be Jack Jenkins. He's coming off of a loss to Gabriel Santos, who's a great fighter, but Jack was close to winning that fight many times. He dropped him early in the first round with a nasty head kick. had him in a deep triangle choke, was smothering him against the fence, which was really impressive to see him do that to such a physically strong fighter like Santos. Santos was just a quicker guy on the feet for the most part of the fight, but Jenkins was still landing great shots throughout the fight. Ultimately, it was really the grappling of Santos that won him that fight, being able to take Jenkins down multiple times and keep him on the mat with his pressure wrestling to then get a submission win. If it remains on the feet, I believe in this matchup, I believe in Jenkins' ability to land powerful shots. I don't see Ramon Tavares mixing in any wrestling. He's primarily a striker and he's going to want to keep this fight standing. But still, in his last fight with Davy Grant, I thought he was a bit basic in his strikes, nothing too creative and seemed hesitant at times. Davy's feints were working really well on him, where someone like Jenkins was mixing in his strikes really well, going to the head with his kicks, going up and down, targeting the body, then the head again. And these were powerful shots. I don't think either of these guys, Jenkins or Tavares, are high level, but I do think Jenkins will clearly be a step ahead in this matchup. I see Jenkins throwing hard leg kicks, finding success in landing the right shots, mixing in the wrestling, and he's durable enough to take any of Ramon Tavares' best shots. Jenkins has never been knocked out. He's super durable. He did break his arm in the Chepe Mariscal fight after he got taken down and landed on his arm, which was unfortunate because that was a really good fight. And even then, Jenkins looked good in that fight against a really great fighter in Chepe Mariscal. So I see Jenkins throwing more volume, not being hesitant like Ramon was in his last fight, and throwing the hard shots that have the more impact, implementing his grappling if he has to, and he'll make it hard for Ramon to land boxing combinations from range. So I like Jenkins' kicking game as well. I like his durability, and he can wrestle if needed in this matchup, where Ramon Tavares, especially in his last fight, I thought his boxing looked a bit basic. He was hesitant a lot in that fight, and it's unlikely for him to implement any wrestling in this matchup. So I just think Jenkinson's leg kicks and body kicks are going to add up, and he's going to mix levels here. Most likely win a decision against Ramon Tavares. Moving on to our next fight, the co-main event, Junior Tafa versus Ibo Aslan. I'm gonna pick Ibo Aslan, and it's mostly because I like. I think he has better striking. We got Tafa, like I said with the other Tafa brother. Highly anticipated return of the Tafa brothers, tied with the greatest sibling duo in the UFC alongside Topuria brothers. Really high level stuff we're seeing out of them. No, I'm just kidding. Seriously though, when I tell you I can never take the Tafa brothers seriously ever again, I just can't do it. Junior just lost to Tuco Tokos. He really allowed Tuco to get a win in the UFC, maybe because they're fighting in Australia now. Maybe they actually decide to train for this fight, but I'm not gonna bank on it. Junior, he isn't that bad. He's not that bad. He does fight well. I think he's more talented than his brother. Actually, he's pretty quick. He has a nice jab. He has great power, but last time around, losing to Tuco Tokos, it was a disappointing performance, but Tuco, he did have a good performance, securing takedowns multiple times, and Tafa didn't look too bad either. He even dropped Tuco in that fight, but ended up still getting submitted. Junior Tafa, he has 6 wins in his career. All of them come by knockout, meaning if he doesn't knock you out, you have a great chance of beating him. And fighting someone like Ibo Aslan, who's never been knocked out, built like a Greek god, a freakish specimen, an insanely athletic physique, holds insane Turkish power in his shots. I don't know how Junior is going to be able to handle that. The 2 losses on Ibo's record was him getting taken down and submitted by Iwan Kutalaba, and mostly recently coming off of a really awkward fight with Billy Elikana, where neither man really did anything at all. The point is, I don't see Junior Tafa utilizing any grappling in this matchup because his grappling is basically non-existent. So he isn't going to sub Ibo. And when it comes to the difference in speed in their shots, I do think Ibo has him beat, along with the athleticism, the power, the accuracy. And I kind of like the fact that Ebo didn't really rush into a firefight in his last fight. He would rather stay, be patient, and strike from the outside than come forward against a young, fast, athletic striker and risk getting knocked out. But of course, he completely overdid it. He was way too hesitant. But against someone like Junior Tafa, if he's patient and doesn't rush into a brawl trying to find the knockout, it's only a matter of time until Ebo's speed and athleticism allows him to find the right shot and outstrike Junior Tafa, right? He doesn't need to rush in there against Junior when he has the speed advantage, in my opinion. If he's patient, he'll eventually outstrike him and will feel how much quicker he is, gain more confidence in his abilities in this matchup, and find the right shots to put him away. In a matchup that consists of two fighters trying to knock each other out, I'm going to side with the man who seems more athletic and durable. I think Aslan will find the right shots over a below average type of fighter. Tafa is more of a pure knockout hunter. He has submission and takedown defense issues. His recent form just looked pretty rough. Where Aslan, I see him being more faster here, more athletic, more durable. He's gonna be patient, striking from the outside and finding the more devastating shots being landed. So I just think Ebo's gonna be able to stay safe early and then find clean counters and find a knockout in this matchup. Moving on to our next fight. The main event of the evening, Carlos Ulberg versus Dominick Reyes. I like this fight a lot. I'm going Carlos Ulberg. We have a high-level striker in Carlos Ulberg who's been on a tear, right? 8-fight win streak, looking really great in every fight. Just beat his first test of high-level competition, in my opinion, to Jan Blachowicz. He did pretty well, not getting hit with that Polish power. And now he's facing Reyes, who, after losing by knockout 3 times in a row, now he's on a 3-fight win streak, all by knockout. Not to anyone special, though. He did just knock out Nikita Krylov in the first round. It was a great knockout. In Dominick Reyes, he did look really good in his last fight. He was patient. He had great distance management. He didn't rush into any silly exchanges. And because he was so patient and was maintaining distance so well, Krylov made the mistake of rushing in, trying to close the distance, which is exactly what Reyes wanted him to do. He basically baited him in to having him rush in and threw a nasty check left hook, moving backwards, and caught him coming in. The thing is, Ulberg is a really smart fighter, and Ulberg has a style that is tough for everyone in this division. I think both guys will be super patient, not rushing in, because both guys have experience getting knocked out after rushing in. But I think Ulberg is able to implement his game plan. He's able to implement his game plan at a higher level, meaning the strikes he's throwing from the outside is more volume, different types of strikes, teep kicks, leg kicks, more fluid in switching stances and flowing in and out, mixing things in differently and being unpredictable with his strikes. And I also think Ulberg is more disciplined with his footwork. Despite Reyes looking really good in his last fight, he was still getting hit a couple times, whereas I feel Ulberg has really mastered the art of managing distance and knows exactly when to strike, when to move in and out. And he's disciplined in a way where he is defensively minded first, meaning his defense seems like his first priority in Ulberg. He allows you to throw what you want. He blocks everything first, downloads your movements, and that's important because it allows him to know what you like to throw, so that then he begins to understand what your game plan is, then being able to take that away from you as the fight goes on. He gets your timing down, he gets your interest down, and begins to slowly take over the fight after his opponents can't throw what they wanted to, while Ulberg is still being defensively minded throughout the fight, in case his opponent decides to switch up their game plan. It's really high level striking from him, and because once he understands your movements, he can then counter you and knows when to engage in the striking with you. And Reyes has been finishing fights quickly recently. Last 3 fights, winning them all by knockout, which is great to see. But coming up against a fighter as disciplined as Ulberg isn't afraid to go to distance, and he's not gonna take as many risks. He will pick you apart from the outside and will gladly do so. Whereas Reyes takes a bit more chances, Despite being on this 3-fight win streak, he still takes chances and puts himself into the fire, which is why I think Oberg will be landing the better shots, staying the more smarter fighter, allowing Reyes to eventually come in and make more mistakes that Oberg can capitalize on. And if the fight does go to distance, which I do think it will, the crowd will be behind Oberg throughout the fight. So if the fight ends playing out close, if the fight ends up playing out close, the judges will be swayed into his favor regardless of how close the fight seems to be. Plus, coming off of the win to Jan Blachowicz, that's an impressive victory in itself. Whereas Reyes has failed against high level competition, and even in his most recent loss to Ryan Spann, that loss is beyond atrocious, right? So I just think Oberg's going to be the more disciplined range sniper in this matchup. He's going to be able to switch stance effortlessly, flow really nicely. He has that defensive mind first in his matchups, and I think he's going to be more volume with the kicks as well. Whereas Reyes, he is a patient counter, but he puts himself in the fire too much, right? And he puts himself in riskier positions more than Oberg, because he was still getting hit in his last fight versus Nikita Krylov, whereas Oberg's going to be way too disciplined to make those mistakes. He's going to allow Dominick Reyes to make those mistakes. I think Oberg will be controlling the tempo at range, have great kicks from the outside, unpredictable kicks with leg kicks, body kicks, and he's just a really smart fighter overall. I think he's going to make the better decisions in this matchup. So the pick has to be Carlos Oberg. And that concludes my picks for this week's UFC card. Let me know what you guys thought. Let me know who you're rolling with. Drop your predictions down below. Let me know if you agree or disagree with my picks. And I'd love to see what you guys thought. As always, I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great day. I love you guys. That's it for me. I'm out. Peace.